She's rugged, she's powerful, and coming in at a whopping 720 horsepower, she is parked in an office worker's driveway without a speck of dust on her. She is the Pavement Princess, an expensive luxury pickup truck that's owned and operated by someone who does not need or use the capabilities of such a truck. And she has become an epidemic on suburban American roadways these past 30 years. But what if I told you that the rise of pickup truck owners since the 90s was not a result of our success, and certainly is not because people are flocking to blue-collar jobs, but is instead a symptom of the overall economic and mental health crises we are facing in America, and is for many people a coping mechanism for living in a country without social safety nets and without the community support that we've had in the past. Well, that's the case I'm going to be making today, and it is a lot to go over, so please be sure to like this video, subscribe if you are new, and let's just get right into it. And thank you to DeleteMe for sponsoring this video. More on them later. So let's start with plywood. This is relevant, I promise. In the United States, a 4-foot by 8-foot plywood sheet is the literal foundation that all construction and woodworking materials are standardized around. Subfloors and houses are built with them. Wall studs are intentionally placed either 16 or 24 inches on center to accommodate them. And standardized cuts of lumber, like the 2x4, are made to this measure so that they can be stacked on top of plywood sheets while being hauled by trains or trucks. Outside of hauling, this practice has two main benefits. The first is so that everything being used in construction is divisible by 4, which just makes the math easier and is actually the same principle that Minecraft is based off of. And then the other benefit is that standardizing cuts of lumber helps you save the amount of cuts that you make and therefore waste that's produced in the process of building. So historically, truck beds were standardized to this measure, so that a 4x8 of plywood could sit comfortably between the wheels, and all of your other construction materials could cleanly be stacked on top of them while being hauled. And this continued all the way up through the 1990s, until trucks started to adopt the crew cab. All of the sudden, 80% of trucks now had 4 doors as opposed to 2, often at the sacrifice of the length of the bed of the truck. And since focusing more on passengers, the design of the pickup truck has become less and less oriented around the workplace over the past 30 years, and has instead focused on comfort, aerodynamics, and size. But while truck beds have gotten smaller during that time, the overall size of pickup trucks absolutely has not. The average pickup is now 30 inches longer, 4 inches wider, 7 inches taller, and 2,000 pounds heavier than a pickup truck was in 1990. Now, with that size has also come sturdier frames, larger engines, more safety systems, and luxury features. But with those features has come cost. The average pickup truck now costs more than my entire college education, and at a much worse interest rate. In 1990, the Ford F-150 had a suggested retail price of $11,200, which would be about $27,000 in today's money. However, the 2025 Ford F-150 median range models are now rolling out at $63,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is a 133% increase in cost, despite real wages having only gone up 15% in that same time. So someone in 1990 could have realistically bought nearly 2.5 Ford F-150s for the same percentage of their income that somebody would be spending today. So why are people doing it? Why are more people than ever before buying pickup trucks, despite them being more expensive, having less utility, and being less easy to navigate as a result of their increase in size? Well, that's what I want to talk about today, because this goes a lot deeper than you might think. But first, I want to quickly address my own personal connection to pickup trucks, before y'all accuse me of being some lifelong soft hands liberal yuppie. I have been around and driven trucks my whole life. I learned how how to drive on an old stick-shift manual transmission Toyota Tacoma, and most of my relatives still drive pickups to this day. My job in high school required driving truckloads of copper wiring up to Chico, California for scrap. In college, I installed flooring in new housing constructions. And in grad school, I spent my summers driving truckloads full of beer around the Lake Tahoe area for merchandising. And while I don't own a pickup truck anymore, I do still drive an SUV because I am over 6 feet tall and I live in the mountains, so I kind of have to in order to survive. I do not care at all if somebody owns a pickup truck, even if they live in a city and are not a blue-collar worker. But I am a socio-economist. And so the rise of oversized, overpriced, and underutilized pickup trucks is a fascinating symptom of the broader economic issues that we're facing in this country, and is something that I really want to talk about. So generally speaking, this video is not about truck owners who actually need them. If you work construction or if you haul stuff as part of your day-to-day life, this video is not about you. Instead, this is going to be about the people who do not need to own a pickup truck, but who buy one anyway. You've all seen those guys. And gals. So at its core, the people who do not need trucks buy trucks because they are a symbol of stability and success. Pickup trucks are starting to cost more money than going to a state university. They are an incredibly reckless waste of money for a lot of Americans, and are oftentimes the single biggest financial burden that an American family has when they own one. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. Even if the pickup truck doesn't make financial sense, the social value that it carries does. Pickup trucks signal that you have a blue-collar identity, or at the very least, signals having blue-collar values to the people around you. In theory. But even that's questionable, as skilled tradesmen make up less than 25% of the workforce in America. And beyond that, this image that we have of a rugged, high-earning, blue-collar man with hometown conservative values is an incredibly small percentage of the American workforce. You are way more likely to find one of these guys in a country music video than you ever are on an actual work site. And in many ways, this guy is just the American version of nationalist propaganda that we saw come out of places like Germany and Russia in the 20th century. If blue-collar values actually exist in the US, they are probably a lot more left-leaning and a lot less financially well-off than we tend to give them credit for. But I digress. In truth, the pickup truck is now so expensive that they are a luxury item more than anything else. They signal to people that you have the $60,000 to spend on your vehicle, and that you have the freedom to engage in masculine hobbies if you wanted to. Things like camping, hunting, gardening, or renovation projects that people with less money oftentimes just don't have the freedom to commit time to. See, the United States is a society that values freedom and individualism above all else. And since we don't really have safety nets in this country, money therefore equals freedom for the individual living in the States. And so spending lots of money signals to other people that you have lots of freedom. And since American marketing and propaganda has equated hard work as the pathway to freedom, then people use having money and free time as a proxy to say that you are a hard worker. And there is nothing that carries more social clout in America than being a hard worker. That's why we brag about being so tired and busy all the time. Whereas other cultures might look at someone being tired and busy and think, wow, they're too stupid and disorganized to have their life together to the point that they can relax, we here in America wear our busyness as a badge of honor. But just because people who drive pickup trucks are spending lots of money doesn't mean that they are actually successful. As an economist, the financing trends around vehicles in America is super concerning to me. The average monthly payment on a new pickup truck is now sitting at $715, and that's before gas and maintenance, which is usually more expensive for these trucks. And the average monthly payment on a used car isn't that much better at $520. When you consider that the median full-time worker in America is bringing home about $4,000-ish a month, month, or $1,200 a month if they're working 30 hours or less. That means there are a lot of people spending a significant portion of their take-home pay on their vehicle alone. So you might assume then that somebody driving an above average costing vehicle makes an above average salary in America and can therefore afford to do so, right? No. Pickup trucks are 4 times as likely to be leased than other passenger cars. And nearly 1 in 5 vehicles being financed every year are pickup trucks. And while we just don't have data on how much these drivers actually earn, we can discern from average debt reports and average interest rates on cars, which are in part determined by your credit score, that a huge subset of Americans who are driving pickup trucks cannot actually afford to be driving these trucks. And we can also safely guess, based off the distribution of American workers, that people driving pickup trucks aren't working blue-collar jobs and therefore don't actually need to own a truck. They own one because there are outside pressures convincing them to own one. This is a classic case of keeping up with the Joneses, where Americans inflate their lifestyle and cost of living, not because they want to for personal reasons, but because they feel like they have to in order to keep up with their friends, family, and neighbors. And those psychological traps that pressure people into more and more consumerism are the most prevalent in America's suburbs. In 2021, Brett McKay from The Art of Manliness published an article about what he called soft suburban dad syndrome. He noticed that as a lot of men became more comfortable, they became disproportionately overweight, antisocial, and depressed when compared to their wives. And especially around the age 30 mark, you see a ton of relationships where the man has theoretically never been doing better by all perceivable metrics. They've got a young, hot wife, they're in a stable career, they've got a car, and they're living in a neighborhood full of young families. And while their wife is glowing and arguably at her prime, the husband is miserable, out of shape, and completely devoid of the spark and ambition that he had through his 20s that got them to where they are today. And while I do agree that suburbia turns a lot of guys into a soulless husk of a human, I have personally noticed another strain of man who haunts the streets of the suburbs. And that's the guy who becomes super fucking insufferable. Giant truck, loud music, politically aggressive, weirdly into productivity podcasts despite being a functioning alcoholic, and overall just generally unpleasant to be around. It's funny, I lived in Section 8 housing until I was 27 years old. If you don't know, that's project housing for poor people, and it was a shockingly peaceful existence. It was always quiet, I never really heard from my neighbors, and there weren't political signs anywhere. But then my income tripled, and so I moved into one of those emerging middle-class neighborhoods for young families. And my life has become anything but peaceful. People are constantly revving trucks, throwing parties in their yard, kids are always doorbell ditching houses, and the cops are constantly going up and down my street, responding to some type of noise complaint or domestic dispute. And while I would definitely prefer to be where I am now as opposed to where I was living in poverty, it is fascinating to see what money and stability does to a lot of men in the suburbs. They've got money, they've got the girl, they're in a house, even if they're only renting it, and yet they are acting out in emotional and insecure ways that you would expect from a teenager, not an alleged man in his 30s. And I think this really embodies the broader crisis that we've been having with men in America these past couple decades. It is not going to blow anybody's mind when I claim that we have a massive issue with male behavior in this country. The male and female demographic at colleges has completely flipped, and young adult men are overwhelmingly dropping out of the workforce. And there's a pretty big disconnect between what straight women want out of men in the dating world and how these men are actually behaving. Now, you all know this at the surface level, but the problem with this conversation is that it's not coming from people who are actually living the masculinity crisis. A lot of complaints about masculinity in America are coming from women, which is a valuable perspective, but it is skewed by a lot of socialization, cultural baggage, and trauma that just isn't relevant to a lot of men. And then you've got men on political extremes who aren't really relatable either. You've got the urban leftist types who are coming from so much privilege or are so mentally unwell that it's kind of gross to listen to them talk. And then you've got the guys on the far right who sound like they're presenting at a fascist rally anytime that they open their mouths. And so I am going to try and meet somewhere in the middle when I talk about this. I grew up in a mixed working class family that a lot of people would describe as having white trash beliefs, lifestyles, and behaviors. I worked blue collar jobs for years before finally breaking into academia, and now I work from the ivory tower of a university as a job market economist. I understand both sides because I have lived both sides without getting particularly radicalized in one direction or the other. And I know that liberals are going to hear that and think that I'm conservative, and that conservatives are going to hear that and think that I'm liberal. And honestly, I'm cool with that. You think whatever you want to. I am a pseudo-academic with a blue-collar background, and I used to be a blue-collar worker who was going to college on the side for the humanities. I have always been the weirdo in the room, and at this point, it's the only scenario that I feel comfortable in. But the thing is that I am, technically, a trained socioeconomist that a lot of people would consider an expert on the labor force. And so I want to start with the impact that economic issues have been having on masculinity in America, because that's something that I am actually qualified to talk about. But first, a word from today's sponsor, DeleteMe. I'm a job market economist who used to track employment scams, so I am well aware of how things like resumes and other tools are used in data breaches in order to steal your personal information. And while anyone can buy your personal information being sold to data brokers online, you do have the right to stay private and protect your personal data. DeleteMe empowers individuals and organizations to reclaim their privacy by removing personal data from online sources, including but not limited to things like your address, phone number, occupation, and even information about your relatives. Information that can be used to make you a target of phishing scams or identity theft. I've been using DeleteMe, and it has been shocking to see how much information about myself that they've been able to remove from the web. And I don't even post personal details on social media. DeleteMe has been the #1 personal data removal service since 2011, and they have a special offer for viewers of this channel. Get 20% off a consumer plan at joindeleteme.com/urgently and use code urgently at checkout. Thank you again to DeleteMe for sponsoring this video. Check out DeleteMe via my link in the description or my QR code on the screen and get 20% off. So, the economy sucks. That's right, 7 years of college just to tell you that. But really, it fucking sucks to be a young adult in America, man or not, in the current economic landscape. But I think that men get hit especially hard by economic turmoil because we're still socialized to be the ones bearing the burden of it, despite being increasingly less able to actually do so. Ever since women were forced into the industrialized workforce during the world wars, and the global population exploded as a result of the baby boom, we have had a surplus, or this glut of workers, that companies value less and less every single year. And while that has led to some fantastic improvements for women's rights and the public perception around what women are allowed to do, not a lot has changed in the public perception of what a man's role is. If you are a straight man in a relationship, and especially if you are a dad, then you are expected to earn the majority of your family's income and generally sacrifice your time and comfort for the sake of others. In the same way that women, statistically, do more of the house chores and spend more time caring for their children, even if both spouses are employed full-time. And while people will disagree with that idea publicly, most people are still internalizing these norms in private, with divorce rates, marital dissatisfaction, and arguments being significantly more common in marriages where the woman makes more money than the man does. And so socially, especially there is a ton of shame caught up in being a man in America if your wife or girlfriend out-earns you. Your masculinity gets belittled, and you are seen as a burden to your friends and family who believe that you should be doing more, which is a pressure that women are just not experiencing to the same degree. And then a lot of allegedly female empowerment content online is then focused on shaming men whenever women have to experience financial or discomfort burdens on a man's behalf. And while I know that that is not true feminism in the sense of gender equality, guys still see those videos and they hear those comments from their friends and family, and that puts an intense pressure on us to bear the full burden of financially supporting and enduring discomfort for the women in our lives, while at the same time receiving less gratitude from society, less money from our jobs, and less social and sexual validation than men would have had in the past because they had the finances to support a long-term relationship. Or to put it in more controversial terms, a lot of guys feel as though they have far less male privilege in exchange for having these same historic male burdens. That observation, whether it's true or not, is a driving force behind things like incels, the red pill movement, and men who feel as though they can't actually win in society and just drop out of it altogether. And I think that the rise of non-blue collar men driving big impractical trucks is another massive side effect of that. Yeah, thought we forgot about pickup trucks for a minute there, huh? Much like the Dodge Ram, sitting in the driveway of a suburban duplex owned by a data analyst, the American man has been divorced of any practical use he may have had as a result of his biological potential. Why am I talking like Norman Osborn? Anyway, for a lot of guys, removing spiders from the bathroom is probably the most manly thing they do on a regular basis. And while plenty of guys will go into the comments and say, I don't need to do manly things in order to be happy, your biology, your psychology, and quite frankly your penis say otherwise. This isn't some red pill thing or some far-right hot take, it's acknowledging that in broader discourse, male hormones and biology often gets ignored, and that testosterone levels in men have absolutely tanked compared to people the same age of generations past. Everything from desk jobs to plastics to a poor diet have been doing this to us. And ironically, as the world has become safer and theoretically healthier, we have become sicker as individual people as a result. I even go to the gym and eat whole foods cooked at home most of the time, but I'm still kind of out of shape and lethargic living my day-to-day life. The sitting, the financial stress, the social expectation to eat donuts at work meetings, and the overall environment that we live in is just not conducive to us being healthy, virile males. And that's taken a pretty big hit to both our hormones and our overall physical and mental health. And when our hormones are out of whack, then we're not healthy, we're not happy, we're not ambitious, and our libido goes out the window on top of us just not behaving in confident or sexy ways around women in general. And I think too many commentators ignore just how important that social and sexual validation is to young men being healthy people mentally. Because if we aren't getting that, then we don't feel confident or valued. And then that combines with the environmental sabotage, creating an entire subclass of men who are sad and isolated. And so I think then that a lot of men try to dig their way out of this hole through superficial expressions of masculinity, like driving a giant truck. See, men do this thing where we are hardwired to assess the status cues of other men so that we know where we fall in the hierarchy of a group. There is a lot of nuance to this, but generally speaking, when a man does not feel like he has enough status for whatever reasons, he will try to artificially boost his status by posturing. So like shaking your hand way too hard, belittling people, wearing trendy clothes as opposed to having your own style, buying expensive cars, living outside their means, etc., etc., etc. Or even doing what I like to call anti-posturing, where we do the opposite of a traditional flex in order to boost our status by appearing as though we don't care, and therefore appearing confident. Think of like the nerd types who call football sports ball, or the blue-collar guys who refuse to ever wear a tie or wear clothes that fit because they don't want to look like they're trying too hard. All of these are very different examples that affect different types of men, but they are all men trying to artificially boost their status in their group by playing on that group's particular insecurities. And trucks are an especially effective way to posture. They are conventionally masculine. America is a car-centric country, so everyone drives a vehicle every single day. They provide you the potential to do things that smaller vehicles don't, like hauling, off-roading, and towing. They make you big and imposing on the road, and they're also crazy expensive, so it's a sign to everyone around you that you have masculine potential and money. Or at least that's how truck drivers probably subconsciously view it. An SUV can often do all of the same stuff that a pickup can do, and is often just as expensive, but marketing and social peer pressure pushes a lot of men in particular towards the pickup truck, even when they don't actually need them on their day-to-day. It is a universally understood display of extravagance. In the same way that just living in a castle gives you a sway of authority over the public, because we are hardwired to figure out what our status in society is so that we can behave in ways that are beneficial to the groups that we're in as a whole. A group of peasants could easily raid a castle and kill a king if they were unified to do so, but we see a lot of historic revolutions fail because systems are necessary in order for large groups of people to survive and thrive. That egalitarianism that you hear about in small tribal groups is really only possible because they are small groups of people. A country of 300 million people could not just magically operate if the government disappeared overnight. Way too many systems are being run by people who are incentivized by certain comforts and benefits to do the job that they do. Economics aside, men tend to posture more the more insecure that they are about their status. And in the modern digital age, where men don't have conventionally masculine jobs, and we are constantly able to compare ourselves to others through social media, it is virtually impossible for us to have a clear sense of what our status actually is, and it is far too easy to feel insecure about our own masculinity because of that. And so one very real reason that trucks are getting bigger and more ridiculous is because the role of men in society has been undermined without the narratives around masculinity changing in a productive way. Sure, there are narratives out there telling men that they need to do better and go to therapy, but treating men like we're just dysfunctional women who need to be fixed is honestly quite insulting and not really a productive way to make change at scale. And sure, giant trucks are expensive, ridiculous, and sometimes dangerous, but they're probably still one of the less harmful ways that the masculinity crisis has been displaying itself in society. Male enrollment in colleges has tanked. And yes, I know, I teach at a university, so of course I perceive this as an issue. So let me be the first to say that we pushed way too many people into four-year universities in the 2000s and the 2010s. It wasn't necessary, and it created an oversurplus of overqualified workers who could just not be paid the amount of money that they thought they deserved based off their degree. I admit that, but I am a professor second, and I am instead a labor market analyst first and foremost. And I can tell you that we have a labor force disaster on our hands right now, because men are dropping out of schools and the workforce at an alarming rate, and are instead just staying home instead of replacing that schooling with something like a trade apprenticeship, the military, or really anything else. According to the Federal Reserve, 14% of 25-year-old males are not employed, which is double the number that we saw decades prior, and is significantly higher than the 4% unemployment rate across the general American population. That means that 1 in every 7 men that you see in their 20s does not have a job, which might surprise you, but absolutely won't surprise any women who have been using dating apps. because surveys suggest that unemployed men are far more likely to be using these apps. One, because they simply have more time to be doing something like doom scrolling, and two, because unemployed men are way less likely to be successful in dating, since steady employment is the #1 trait that surveyed women look for in a man that they're considering. And so they have to keep using these apps because they keep going on first dates, but are never able to secure a second date because of their unemployed status. So ladies, if you're wondering where all the good men have gone, they're at work. Now, before I start offering solutions to all of this, I do think it's important to quickly address the elephant in the room, and that is the political component to the rise of large pickup trucks. Like I said before, Americans drive vehicles every single day, and so, like it or not, our vehicle becomes an extension of our identity. Yes, there is some utility behind what we drive, like I drive an SUV because I live in the snowy mountains and I have to, but outside of limited utility, the vehicle that we drive is usually a reflection of our aesthetic values. Teslas are a status symbol. Subaru Outbacks are an ideological symbol. Minivans are a symbol that you don't know what a condom is. And pickup trucks are a cultural symbol. They represent rural identity and nostalgia, even for people who don't live out in the country. And for a lot of men, they are a way of pushing back against what they perceive as liberal threats to this country or their way of life. Conservative propaganda is intense in the United States. Our news stations shamelessly lie to us. Republican politicians campaign based off cultural fear as opposed to actual policies. That's also why they keep winning, by the way. And even social media algorithms are hardwired to make us feel positively about the major corporations that control literally everything. And if you've only lived in one place your entire life, or you're not particularly educated and traveled, it makes sense why you think that the world is out to get you, because major corporations want you to be fixated on maintaining the status quo, even if that status quo is less than 100 years old and is actively killing us. But it's not entirely delusion from propaganda either. Our economy sucks, our local communities have broken down, and Americans just generally don't trust each other anymore. We don't feel like we have social safety nets, oftentimes because we don't, and so Americans live their life terrified that they are absolutely screwed if anything bad ever happens to them. So some of us compensate for that anxiety by buying big trucks, big houses, big guns, or just trying to make ourselves look intimidating so that we can reduce our risk of being harmed by other people. And while we all feel that anxiety, who you choose to blame for that anxiety largely depends upon the culture, economics, and politics of where you happen to live. Some people blame major corporations and organized religion for their problems, others blame the ramifications of imperialism, and some people, like our truck driving brothers, blame misguided liberal policies that have also created issues. I grew up in Nevada, but several generations of my family all grew up in Northern California, and every single person I'm related to who was born in NorCal has had to move to either Las Vegas or Reno in order to get a job and financially survive. Because California has become a disaster of a state to live in for anyone who's either not super wealthy or who is living in poverty and willing to remain on the state's dole, with middle-class families bearing the overwhelming majority of tax burdens in that state. It's not propaganda, it's just the truth. And the same goes for corporations, organized religions, and imperialism too. All of these things have played a part in controlling the lives of individual people and making our overall quality of life worse. But it's not cool to be nuanced about that, and so most Americans will pick one or two enemies that they then latch onto as the primary evil that they believe is ruining their life. Remember when I talked about anti-posturing earlier, where guys will do the opposite of a conventionally masculine thing in order to bolster their status by appearing confident? Well, I think the associated movement against pickup trucks is a fascinating thing to briefly touch on before I start offering solutions to everything everything I've just said, and I do promise to offer some solutions, so bear with me. So, back when I was in high school, this really terrible thing happened where young men started wearing fedoras and then incorporating certain chivalry terms like milady into everyday conversation. I am so sorry if you are about 30 years old and had to relive that trauma, but while we can look back on that now and laugh or cringe about it, you can't deny that this was a result of the early onset of a massive male mental health crisis, and was in many ways a response to the rise of social media. Teenage boys saw things like the coming out movement call out homophobia, they saw the Me Too movement call out sexual abuses of men in power, and they saw the tail end of third wave feminism drive straight women into extremes of promiscuity or prudishness. This was a very confusing time to be 15 years old, and unfortunately a lot of guys were too young or naive to realize that this discourse wasn't really about them. And so that led to a lot of internalized misandry amongst young men in the 20-teens. Guys started to dress in really corny ways to signal that they were enlightened and safe by wearing overly tight or formal clothes. They tried to bring back a cherry-picked form of chivalry that, again, could signal that they were safe and enlightened, and they based their entire personality around being nice with the hopes that that would convince straight women to want to date them in the midst of all the discourse going on online. To basically say, hey, I'm not a product of toxic masculinity, I'm a nice guy. And yeah, it didn't work. But in spite of that approach not working, the nice guy persona continued to evolve in unproductive and misguided ways. You saw the rise of incel culture, where guys who were unsuccessful at dating started to believe that there was a mass conspiracy against nice guys like them, and that they were involuntarily celibate as a result. That internalized misandry then created mythical enemies online, known as the Chad or the Alpha, who, while conventionally attractive to women, was ultimately perceived as not good for them because he was a product in their eyes of toxic masculinity or just didn't have the same level of emotional maturity or feminism that they did. And so in more recent years, that nice guy persona has started to adopt an alternate form of masculinity that they have dubbed the Sigma male. Fortunately, most Sigma male content online is just clowning on guys who think this way. It's ironic, it's not serious. But there are guys who think this way, and they base their whole personality around anti-posturing and or shaming the masculinity of other men to make themselves feel better. They're the type of guy who sees those K-truck memes and thinks, yes, I need a tiny vehicle so that I'm not associated with those brutes in the giant pickup trucks. Or at the type of guy at a party who reads poetry and then sits there and goes, I only ever let women finish first. And you have to sit there and go, yas, king, because it's not socially acceptable to antagonize him, even though the good things that he's saying are technically coming from a place of toxic manipulation against women. It's a catch-22, and while I don't know how to address that, I do have some suggestions for young men out there who aren't sure how to navigate their personal masculinity in this new world order that we found ourselves in. First and foremost, you need to have enough self-awareness so that you can comfortably be yourself around women. Women can smell inauthenticity from a mile away, and fakeness reeks. Even if you are a good liar or a good actor, not being true to yourself is eventually going to catch up to you. You're going to slip, and then you're going to betray the trust of people who fell in love with a fake version of you. So just be yourself, as corny as that sounds. That's going to attract friends and partners to you who fall in love with the version of you that's the easiest for you to maintain because it's the most authentic version of you. But with that, also understand that being authentically yourself can include being authentically nuanced and authentically authentically considerate of others. Okay, you're allowed to be both things. Like, I like to say the fuck word, I have a potty mouth, I know, but I'm probably not gonna swear at a religious old woman, because I'm also an authentically considerate person, as well as someone who authentically uses swear words a lot. Okay, both things are allowed to be true. The truer you are to yourself, the fewer misconceptions that people will have about you, and the more people that you will slowly attract into your life who have similar values and interests as you. Speaking of values and beliefs, I would highly caution you against adopting any isms into your life whenever you can help it. Unless you are part of a specific religion, self-identifying with a political ideal, with an economic system, or with a philosophy is just kinda cringe. You can be a Buddhist, like that's fine, but being a capitalist or a conservative or an existentialist is just weird and cringy, and it really makes you come across like you don't have a nuanced or deep understanding of culture and history. So in the words of Ferris Bueller, don't be an ism, be yourself. And on that note, it's important that you are putting self-awareness before self-improvement. Toxic productivity is very much a thing, and sometimes doing healthy things can end up being unhealthy in the wrong context. Maintaining a diet can become unhealthy if you develop a disorder. Waking up at 5 a.m. to work out when you went to bed at 1 in the morning is unhealthy. You need to understand why you're doing the things that you do, and if you have an end goal in mind. That way you can reverse engineer that end goal to where you are right now, as opposed to where you think you should be in life as a person, because that's going to help you take effective next steps towards your goal. And also be okay with exploring things. Like, it is great to try new things and to broaden your perspective, but anytime that you explore something new, you want to approach it with a bit of caution and skepticism, because there are a lot of charlatans online who are actively lying to people about things like finance, health, and spirituality. And if you fall into those traps before you've learned enough about what a space is actually like, you're gonna get scammed at worst, or at best, you're gonna become one of those people who's changing their religion or their diet every other week. And no one wants to be around those people. It's the same reason why you don't marry someone whom you've just met. Even if she's super pretty and likes all the same video games as you, you need to meet her family, you need to travel together, you need to experience stress together. You, quite frankly, probably need to move in together for a while first. That way you have enough time and exposure to figure out if any inevitable red flags that will show up are or aren't deal breakers for you and are instead something that you can work through or compromise on. So get really self-aware about what your personal needs and wants are. That way you can explore new things that you might be interested in without getting scammed or falling prey to propaganda. And then when it comes to the people out there who want to support the struggling young men in their life or in society at large, you need to have a nuanced approach to male mental health that goes beyond simple talk therapy or emotional maturity. Men are not dysfunctional women. We have different hormones, we are socialized differently, we are perceived differently by other people, and we are often conditioned to prioritize different things. While this isn't universally true, the average man will probably see more improvements to his mental health by exercising than he will by emotionally opening up to his friends. Getting a better job and/or making more money will probably improve his mental health faster than learning to accept himself the way that he is. Most men want to be valued by others and perceived as useful, that way he can get some forms of social, sexual, or financial validation from his efforts. And so if you can push the men in your life in those directions, that's going to end up being very useful. And while I'm not opposed to education or therapy at all, I do think it's important to understand and appreciate that most teachers and therapists are women, and that a lot of men just won't relate very well to school or therapy as a result of that. It's kind of like picking an OBGYN. Yes, there are plenty of male OBGYNs out there who are very good at their jobs and not creepy, and there are plenty of women out there who prefer a male OBGYN because that gender distance just gives them a sense of security. However, most women would probably feel uncomfortable around a male OBGYN, in the same way that a lot of young men probably feel uncomfortable opening up around a female teacher or a female therapist. For better or worse, we're just kind of hardwired to intrinsically trust people who look like us. Whether it's true or not, we often just assume that somebody who looks like us had similar experiences, was socialized in a similar way, and can therefore empathize with us more effectively than somebody else could. Incidentally, this is also why diversity in the workplace is actually important, especially in like education or psychology, because it means that you can better serve your clients. But I digress. I've personally used therapy twice in my life, and I have had two radically different experiences with it. So back when I was a flight medic, I had access to therapy through the VA hospital. I was not a veteran, but by the nature of my job, I was dealing with some pretty intense stuff that veterans could oftentimes more easily relate to. And I had a great time. It was fantastic. Now, however, I am working at a university. And so last year, I enrolled in some clinical trials that they were doing where they had professors meet with therapists in order to see the impact that that would have on their mental health. And every single therapist that I met with was a 22-year-old, financially privileged, straight white woman. And we just could not relate to one another. My background, my personality, and my experiences were so different than what they were used to that we just could not make headway, especially considering that they were only PhD students and hadn't met very clients before to begin with. And I ended up dropping it because having to go to that talk therapy every Tuesday and Thursday was causing me more mental distress than was actually being alleviated by going. Also, massive disclaimer, I don't suffer from any serious or chronic mental health issues, so it was not a danger to myself or anybody else for me to stop going to that therapy. If a man has a proper disorder, get him in to see a professional, and a lot of times get him medicated, okay? It's important. But that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Male mental health is nuanced and complex. And so it's important that you're not pushing the men in your life to be ensnared in a bunch of medical debt or to go to something that's actually causing them more dread than it's curing. If he doesn't have a real clinical disorder, then ask yourself, is he lonely? Does he feel valued by his family, friends, or at work? Does he get proper food and exercise to keep his hormones in check? Does he have expectations on himself at school that he just can't meet? And are any of those things the reasons why he is sad and isolating? Because once those insecurities start to go away, the more toxic sides of his masculine expression will diminish too, and then confidence and healthy behaviors will follow. And then he won't feel the need to posture anymore. I'll see you in the next video.